Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us here. We are going to talk about virtual currency and Second Life. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Tom Hale, and I've been around the digital media space for about 15 years, first at Macromedia, then at Adobe, and now at Linden Lab. And the tag here says my name is T. Linden because in Second Life, all employees of Linden Lab are given a name, which is their in-world name, and mine is T. Linden. So should you join Second Life and look for me, I am T. Linden. I'm very happy to have you guys with me this morning, and I am excited to talk to you about virtual currency. So I wanted to start by kind of telling a little bit of an anecdote about how I came to Second Life. And when I was leaving Adobe and looking for the next thing for me to do, one of the things that I used in my criteria was making sure that whatever company I joined had a really, really great business model. And so when I looked at Second Life, I realized that Second Life had a great business model. A failed business model is not the problem that Second Life needs to solve. It has a tremendous business model around virtual currency, as well as other things, but we're going to talk and focus on the virtual currency kind of model today. And I'll talk a little bit about why I think it's such a great business model in this presentation. Of course, I want to say kudos and apologies to Paul Beard, who provided the wonderful graphic. You can check out what he writes at paulbeard.org, and you can get a t-shirt if you like. When you think about virtual currency, you have to put it in the context that you're thinking about applying it. And in terms of today's talk, I want to kind of put it in one or two of these buckets, because virtual currency has very different both meanings and contexts when you think about the different applications that might utilize it. So, for example, in gaming, virtual currency is most often related to purchase of in-game goods or elements that actually enhance gameplay. In online communities, virtual currencies can actually be non-monetary. They can be about points or status or prestige or actions that are taken that advance you on a leaderboard and give you more status and prestige in the community. And that's very different from an economic virtual currency. In social networks, virtual currencies can be both mediums of exchange and mechanisms for exploring status and prestige. In virtual worlds, one of the things that's most interesting about virtual currencies is that they most often are a mechanism of exchange. And so we're going to focus on, probably by definition, the gaming and virtual worlds uses of virtual currencies in this presentation. But it's really important to note that if you look across these four categories of activity on the web, all of them have a lot to gain and learn from virtual currencies and the way that they're managed. In fact, it's most interesting to me that in the space of the last 12 months, virtual currencies have kind of come up as the business model answer to that question that was posed in the first slide, which is that what's the best business model for an internet company or an internet service? And virtual currency, and many times, is one of the short list answers of how do we make money. So let's talk about what really drives virtual currencies. Well, it really goes to, it's sort of obvious, but virtual currencies are generally something that you purchase in order to buy something, which is a virtual good. And the consumer motivations behind purchasing virtual goods start primarily with this sort of need to establish identity. It's a form of self-expression. This can take the form of customizing your avatar, of buying clothing items or brand items that represent what you want to project to the world around you or to the community around you. And in Second Life, this often takes the form of clothing. There's a gigantic fashion community in Second Life that enables people to express themselves with an incredibly wide range of choices about what they wear, what they say, what they're telling people by the clothes that they wear. And this is very much an analog to the real world. The choices that we make about the clothing that we wear or the objects that we attach to ourselves and to our identities in the real world actually translate directly into the virtual world. In many cases, people are making the same kinds of choices about what they want to express in the virtual world as they do in the real world. The second consumer motivation for virtual goods is doing more. And this is primarily expressed in the game context. You can think about either purchasing or working hard to earn gold to purchase a virtual item or a virtual good that increases the capability of your character or the utility of the game or the utility of the platform. I think the classic example of this is as you level up in any kind of MMORPG, generally the virtual goods are part of the steps that you need to take to level up, and you're given more capability, more utility as you do this. And of course, this has led to some interesting practices in games such as gold farming, where users spend hours and hours and hours in the game creating virtual goods or earning status and powers, and then leverage that time into money by selling those goods to people who have less time, who then consume the goods and take those powers and capabilities without having to invest the time to get there. This is a proven model, and has really come to preeminence in many kind of gaming circles under the model that it's very easy to get started in a game, and then as you are becoming more and more invested in the gameplay or in the world that you're playing, you begin to sort of invest both in the virtual goods. And so instead of paying an upfront fee or even a monthly fee, you're buying virtual goods along the pathway. And this was a model that originated in Asia over the last 10 years or so, and has really come to preeminence and starting to be sort of the answer to many gaming companies saying, how do we make money in this space? The third one, and I think this is actually more of a social value, but it's related to the other two. It's about building relationships. A virtual good, think of it as the mechanism by which you build relationships with other people in your community or even outside of your network by giving them gifts or sending them messages. And in fact, I think this is a very, very kind of broad concept. Excuse me. It's broader than just virtual goods. It actually goes to many forms of communication. You think about the picture that I took while I was on the train looking at Mount Fuji, and I sent that to a friend saying, I'm thinking of you. That's a communication act, but in some sense the photo is a kind of gift. It's a transfer of information, a transfer of a feeling. I'm thinking about you at this time. And making those kinds of experiences between individuals very, very easy turns out to be a very interesting business. I'm sure people are familiar with the phenomenon on Facebook of people buying gifts for other members of their network on their special day, their birthday, for Valentine's Day or whatever. And this is a pretty interesting kind of model here. If you think about these three interlocking consumer motivations, depending on the type of site or type of value that you provide to your users, you might lean one way or the other and mix these three values in differing amounts. Now, of course, on the other side, what's the publisher motivation, and why is virtual goods or virtual currency a very good business model? Well, we talked a little bit about this before. The truth is that most of the value, I would say, around and motivation around getting into virtual currency or virtual goods is the fact that this is a direct monetization model. You're not monetizing ads or eyeballs or advertisers. You are monetizing the users themselves. And so to the degree that you can engage users, you will monetize them themselves. And that's a very powerful, strong relationship with a customer that's direct. And it tends to be, if you're successful at it, both a high-margin business and a sticky business. So the models here are pretty straightforward. There's the free-to-play model that I described, where you get into the game, you get into the experience for free, and then as you sort of begin to advance or invest more in the game, you begin to pay for virtual goods along the path, and of course to do that you need virtual currency. The hybrid model is an interesting one, where you have both maybe a premium subscription model. This is like Second Life, like Dungeons & Dragons, many other games, where you're both paying a subscription fee and have a virtual goods model. There's the direct-to-consumer model, where you are publishing the virtual goods and creating the virtual goods and selling them directly. And then there's a model like Second Life, which is really more user-generated content. Second Life, or Linden Lab, doesn't create content other than sort of starter content. What happens is most of the users themselves create the content, sell the content, make a market in the content. The other motivation here, of course, is the fact that not only is it direct monetization and a direct relationship with their customers, it's actually a great business. If you think about the kinds of dollars you can earn per customer as a site or as a game publisher or as a world creator, with virtual goods, you can expect to extract $2 or $3 per month, but in some cases you can extract very, very large sums, up to triple-digit average lifetime value, which means you're probably monetizing some of your customers, many times, sometimes into the thousands of dollars over the lifetime. This is quite interesting, again, because it's direct, but also because the numbers involved are pretty significant. To put it in context, if you were to think of Google's dollar per unique user, you might see Google at somewhere between $20 and $30 per unique user per year. By contrast, if you compare that with something like Second Life, we actually extract something like $70 to $75 per unique user per year. Now, the number of unique users in Second Life's case is much, much smaller, obviously, but the depth of the monetization is incredibly high. And then the last point of publisher motivation is the degree of engagement. Not only do virtual goods, if they're purchased to enhance your identity, become part of a model where you're invested in the identity that you've created, in the avatar or character that you've built, or in the powers of and in the gameplay that you've invested in, but also you're invested in the community, and you're invested in representing yourself to that community. This is a phenomenon in Second Life that we observe very deeply, which is that our average kind of customer engagement is over the course of 2 years. At the same time, there's a financial investment. You know, if you've spent, I don't know, $10 or $15, your investment isn't that great. You're not spending a tremendous amount of money, but you have spent enough money that you've got an asset, whether it's the investment in the armor and swords that you used to play the game, or in the identity that you've created. That deep engagement is something that's very attractive, I think, for any site publisher. Great. So by way of backup, let's talk about the business models. I want to make a very clear distinction between the publisher-created content and the user-created content. Publisher-created content is probably something more along the lines of a game where all of the content in the world is created by the game publisher, whereas in Second Life or something like InView, most of the content is user-created. And the business models that fall out of those two models are listed here. In the direct model, obviously, you're selling the virtual goods yourself, so those sales can become a source of revenue. Selling the currency to enable the purchase is the other source of revenue. And this is sort of probably the most common model that you see around virtual currency. Also, we're starting to see more platform fee kind of business models where vendors or publishers are going to brands and trying to establish brand partnerships and extract a platform fee for bringing the virtual goods into their world. There's also emerged a set of companies that are doing this in kind of a cross-platform or cross-world way, solving the licensing problem or the technology problem. In the indirect model, what's interesting about this is that because you're not directly selling the goods to the consumer, it's a user-generated content model where the users, or in our case we call them the residents, are exchanging goods back and forth. The kinds of businesses that fall out of this can be the transaction fees that enable the exchange of the goods and services, advertising and listing fees, the services, the exchange fees around extracting from the virtual currency US dollars, or going and purchasing US dollars or any other real-world currency for virtual currency. And these models are a little different. They tend to be more focused on the microtransaction, on the idea that you are enabling someone with a purchase of a virtual currency to go into an environment and not have any carrying cost, any friction on the transaction. The only friction, especially in our case, is when you leave or enter the system. And so as a result, there's sort of an advantage intrinsically in terms of making your transaction frictionless in terms of staying in the virtual currency. The last, of course, is this hybrid model, which is combined with other elements. And I think one of the things that actually sets Linden Lab and Second Life apart from many of the virtual worlds is that or games is that we have a model which combines with this concept of land, which is sort of a persistent hosted space. And the interesting thing here is that some of our customers pay Second Life or Linden Lab on the order of hundreds of thousands of dollars per year for this service, and that kind of monetization is both interesting because of its scale, but also highly persistent, because the reason why they can pay that amount of money is because they actually built a business and are funding the cost of their business and paying that back to Linden Lab. So I want to make a distinction here between what we've been talking about, which is virtual goods and virtual currency, and a virtual economy. Because one of the things that really sets Linden Lab and Second Life apart is the fact that we're not just a virtual currency in the direct-to-consumer model. We are not just a virtual goods model where we're using that virtual currency to buy virtual goods, or consumers are doing that. We're actually an economy. And the trick of this, of course, is that once you have a virtual economy, you run into some of the challenges of managing a virtual economy. What sets us apart is that in many cases, people are entering into the virtual economy with the intent of making money. They will create goods, they will sell goods, and they will collect virtual currency, and at the end of that, they will try and take that virtual currency and extract US dollar profits from it. And this creates a number of interesting challenges for any company for trying to pursue this. not the least of which is trying to manage that economy. So I'm going to turn to discussing a little bit about the Second Life economy as a way of context around virtual currencies. So why is this interesting? Why am I somebody who is interesting to talk about this? What's here on the screen is our quarterly trends of several of the key metrics around our Second Life economy. We track a lot of metrics, but these four are probably most interesting to look at. We'll start in the upper left-hand corner. One is the total of user-to-user transactions on a quarterly basis, and it's measured in millions of U.S. dollars. You can see in the last quarter it was 144 million of total exchange. That's a pretty interesting. That's a pretty interesting number. If you think about it kind of on an annual basis, that's roughly a $500 million GDP for Second Life, and that puts us somewhere in the range of several small countries in the real world economy. And that's been on a nice trend over the last 4 quarters. The next metric, of course, is the amount of virtual currency exchanged on the Lindex, and we'll talk about what the Lindex is and what this number means. But what you see is that this is a steady state with slight growth of exchange between residents, where they are actually trading the virtual currency for U.S. dollars and U.S. dollars for virtual currency. The third metric is the quarterly XStreet sales. XStreet is our web catalog. The number here is interesting not because of its scale, because it's only about 1% of the overall economy, but because of its growth rate. You can see that it's been on a nice growth rate from its inception and an accelerated growth rate recently. All of this is a function of user hours, which is the amount of time people spend in the world, and that's also been on a nice growth trend. The interesting thing about user hours is that if you actually aggregate this and look at it on a per user basis, the average amount of time that people spend in Second Life is roughly 40 hours per month. And if you think about it from the perspective of entertainment, that's roughly 10 hours a week, maybe 2, maybe 3 movies. That's a pretty interesting investment, especially when you consider that is the mean, the average, which means there are obviously some people who are much less engaged, but some people who are much more deeply engaged. Great. So now that we've sort of established that our economy is large and interesting, let's actually just quickly talk about the elements of a virtual economy. Obviously, there's the environment, the context for the virtual economy. There are the virtual goods, which are the things that people want, whether they're user-generated or publisher-generated, as we discussed. But then there's the virtual currency. And I think this is important. I want to read the words here, word for word, so you guys can think about them. A virtual currency, from our perspective, if you read our terms of service, and this language is directly from our terms of service, is a limited license right to use a feature of our product and are not redeemable for any sum of money or monetary value. And that's a very important piece of language because it defines what the virtual currency is. It's not a currency. It's a right. It's a limited license. And people are free to trade that limited license amongst themselves, but it's not something that is a redeemable currency. Then there's the marketplace, which is the mechanism for the listing and promotion of virtual goods and services. We have a marketplace that is both in the world, and that's actually built into the software of Second Life, and we have a marketplace that's on the web, which is called XStreet, and it's easy to browse and sort of more in the 2D e-commerce model. And then there's an exchange, which is really a mechanism for the purchase and redemption of the currency. And I'll make the point that some virtual economies have those exchanges on their domain, as we do. The Lindex is a Second Life property. It's available from our website. We run it. We manage it. Some game publishers or virtual currency publishers make their exchanges. The exchanges happen off of their domain, and that removes them from many of the interesting challenges around managing a virtual currency. And then, of course, there's the money supply itself, which is the amount of currency in circulation. If you are not, if there's no exchange and there's no way to take the virtual currency out of the virtual currency and into a real world currency, the money supply becomes less important, although it is important when you consider what the exchange rate would be to make sure you're very cognizant of the money supply. We'll talk about that in a second. All right, now let's talk just briefly to sort of set a high-level pattern for what the virtual economy looks like. Here we have Second Life. There's the in-world experience. There's the X Street web marketplace, as I discussed. There's the Lindex currency exchange, and we've made available APIs and capabilities in our platform so that third parties could build exchanges and third parties could build marketplaces. And I think for most game and world publishers, this model is actually a reasonable model. People can actually extend their virtual economies off their domains, and that's sometimes a very good solution. Content creators come to the platform, they create content. Consumers come to the platform, they want to consume content. They're looking for virtual goods for the reasons we mentioned before. And that dynamic creates the sort of loop of the economy. In our case, it starts with Linden Dollar purchases. Consumers purchase Linden Dollars either from Linden Lab or from each other. They then use those Linden Dollars to pay for things and receive virtual goods in return. And when the Linden Dollars have accumulated on the creator side, where I now have a balance of the virtual currency that I want to trade in, I then sell that for U.S. dollars, and this becomes the virtuous circle of the economy because for every sale there's a purchase on the other side. And I'll emphasize one point here, which is really important, which is to say, when someone wants to cash out of Second Life and take their U.S. dollar profits out, they're not redeeming them from us. They're not redeeming them from Linden Lab. They're redeeming them from someone else who is holding and willing to buy Linden Dollars from them. And that is the sort of phenomenon of currency sales, which happens on our exchanges and on third-party exchanges, and this is the phenomenon of selling Linden Dollars for U.S. dollars. And the people who do this we call currency traders, and they're feeding this supply, if you will, of U.S. dollars in exchange for Linden Dollars. Currency sales is one of the mechanisms by which the economy operates, and, if you will, total value is injected into the economy. The other vector into the economy are sources of the currency, and in our case, we provide for some of our customers who pay us a monthly subscription fee, a monthly stipend, and that represents new money supply entering into the economy. We also have sales directly to consumers, and I'll talk about that, and we call that the money supply, which is sold on the Lindex. And that is how Linden Lab, in many cases, participates in the economy. We become the direct vendor of Linden Dollars to consumers. But we only do that on occasion. If I were to characterize the amount of Linden Dollars that we sell versus the amount of Linden Dollars that are exchanged by our customers, it is in the vast minority, low single-digit percentages. There is, let's see, get me back here. There's something called the sink, and this is actually how Linden Dollars are removed from the economy. In the classic money supply management scenario, sources increase the money supply, sinks remove the money supply. In this case, these are sort of microtransaction fees that we charge for people to promote their goods or to upload content as part of the mechanism of being a creator who's trying to market to consumers. These small charges are one of the ways that we remove money supply. And then the last, of course, is currency buys. If a creator has aggregated enough Linden Dollars and they want to actually capture some profits, they will sell their Linden Dollars for U.S. dollars, and the currency trader on the other side of that transaction will trade them U.S. dollars for Linden Dollars and then go around and sell that to someone else. So this is sort of the model for the economy, some of the players and the dynamics of it, and I think as we go forward, we'll step forward on that. So the interesting and maybe most kind of non-obvious parts of this is that if you are managing a money supply, one of the things that you have to do is figure out how you're going to value that currency. And of course, our approach to this is to allow the marketplace to value the currency, but we want to make sure that we provide a stable medium of exchange. One of the risks of an early-stage economy or an early-stage virtual currency is that the laws of supply and demand apply, and if you oversupply the economy, the value goes down, and therefore the value of the goods that are denominated in your currency, your virtual goods, goes down. And if you constrain supply, the currency becomes hypervalued, and it becomes difficult to actually manage the value of the currency, and becomes an opportunity for maybe a Wild West kind of mentality. And if you look at the bottom image, the high-low average exchange rate, you can see the sort of cluster of spiky red sails on the left-hand side of the graph, and that was very early on in the sort of history of Second Life. The supply and demand equation was both changing rapidly because of so many new users coming, but it was also something that was it's not a well-understood mechanism, and therefore there were dramatic spikes in the marketplace. As we move to the right, you see a relatively steady trend in terms of the exchange rate between Linden dollars and U.S. dollars. It's because we've been able to understand the dynamics of the market. So to start, the exchange is basically a way of people to exchange U.S. dollars for Linden dollars and vice versa. They do that via market and limit buy selling orders like most marketplaces. There's a small spread of about 4 cents per dollar, which is what motivates currency traders to be on the other side of transactions, which again gets us out of the business of having to redeem virtual currencies for U.S. dollars. And then there are small transaction fees on the buyer and seller side, which enable us, which is how we both sustain and defer the cost of that marketplace. And if you look at the top graph, you can see that we've managed to maintain the pricing of Linden dollars to U.S. dollars relatively steady and within a trading range represented by the red bars. How do we do this? Well, we're managing exchange rate. We're using the sinks to counterbalance inflation. We're basically reducing money supply by sinking it. When there's upward price pressure, which is to say there's more demand than there is supply of the currency, we actually sell. We sell into that marketplace and therefore relieve that pressure, and those are sources. And we only sell Linden dollars when demand exceeds supply, and that generally happens only once or twice a week on the weekends when usage is most heavy. And this is an interesting dynamic, the net of which is that the currency has retained its stability, which is, of course, one of the sort of precursors for actually having an economy that can be well managed. So let's talk about the money supply for a second. This is a graph of the money supply as it's grown over time from sort of the beginning of the history of Second Life. What you can see is that it's reached over 6 billion Linden dollars, which is roughly 24 million U.S. dollars. What's interesting about the money supply is that it turns over roughly twice a month, and this is something that economists call velocity, which is to say for how many times is a Linden or a dollar used in a given transaction in any given month. We have 50 million U.S. dollars of transactions. We have a money supply of roughly 24 million, so the velocity is roughly 2. The interesting thing to note here is that as Second Life grows and as more consumers come to it and more creators come to it, we have to actually expand the money supply to maintain the stability of the currency, and it's essentially expanding by about 2% a month. All right, so all of that has been about virtual currency, which I think is obviously interesting because that's the topic of today. But of course, a virtual currency in its abstract is not very meaningful. You actually have to talk about the virtual currency in the context of the goods which people want to purchase. And from our perspective, it's probably worth taking a minute or so to talk about the dynamics of our marketplace. In gross terms, Second Life has a very, very large marketplace, and I think that takes us to the point of being at scale and having many hundreds of thousands of customers who are creating content. The number as it stands today is 270 terabytes of content stored in our databases, with 250,000 new objects being created each day, and some upwards of 100 million plus items. That's a very, very large data set, and the interesting thing from our perspective is that analyzing that data set in the aggregate is pretty hard, because there's less of a taxonomy around that data set than you might imagine. It's user-generated content. Users don't always, if you will, tag the identity of their object in a way that's meaningful. There is metadata around it most often when they want to promote that object, but it becomes something that is relatively challenging to analyze. Recently, however, because we've introduced our web catalog, we now have actually a very, very rich data set for looking at the kinds of goods that people purchase, because each one of these transactions has a good deal of metadata. Our web catalog is called X Street. You can see a screenshot of it down there in the bottom right. There's about 1 million listings on X Street. There's dozens of categories. You can see some of them from animals down to weapons, vehicles, even used items, which I find interesting in the context of virtual goods. And we have tens of thousands of active merchants there. And what's interesting, of course, if you look at that list of categories, you see that avatar, accessories, and appearance are the top categories in terms of numbers of items in each one. along with apparel. But some of the interesting surprises there, if you look at home and garden, building components, you look at the vehicles, that many of these items are actually ones that relate to sort of a persistent space that you're customizing. You're building your garden, you're building your home. And again, that's one of the unique features of Second Life that makes it interesting. So to characterize this overall marketplace, one of the things that you always look at when you try and look at it in the aggregate is like, okay, well, is it a is it a power law kind of marketplace? Is it a long tail kind of marketplace? Where's the concentration of the economic activity? And to characterize that a little bit, if you look at the catalog of items, it's long tail. There are no super concentrations in terms of economic activity around either categories or items. The sort of strongest is the one that we talked about, is the accessories and appearance and apparel. That's kind of probably the biggest concentration, but even that is sub 5%. But when you turn it around and you look at the shoppers and the merchants who create the content, it is very much a power law marketplace. There are shoppers who, if you will, create the bulk of the activity and the bulk of the economic activity. There are merchants who supply the bulk of the activity. And so as a result, you have something more like a power law distribution with a small number of people who account for a significant amount of the activity. All right. Before we go into the open conversation part of this, I figured I would just actually quickly hit some of the most frequently asked questions about this, because I've talked for a while, but we're going to get into some conversation in a minute, but I just want to hit these questions quickly. The first one, which is the classic, I think I've had this in every time I've talked about it, is are the profits derived taxable? And I think the answer is quite clear, which is that your taxing authority will tell you the answer to that question. And in general, any income you get, if you make income from it, it becomes something that's taxable, particularly if it's denominated in a currency that is managed by a government. So, which is to say, if you take cash out of any virtual environment, I think the point of view is that it is taxable. How do we recognize revenues around virtual currency? Since it's a limited license, sort of a right, that's what a virtual currency represents. The typical approach is the revenues are recognized over the life of the system that you're getting a license to use, and whether that's 24 months or 36 months is very kind of up to the game publisher to determine. But it's really interesting to recognize that it's something that gets deferred over the usage rights of the life. One of the classic questions is it expensive to support and manage a virtual currency? Are there all sorts of considerations you need to take into account? And I think the quick answer here is it's less expensive than you might think. The classic costs are the support costs, because you're dealing with people's funds, and many times there are transaction costs that go along with it. There are technical costs, but the costs in all are not as great as you might imagine. It's not prohibitive, and I think in many cases, we're starting to see the emergence of platforms that provide virtual currency services to other publishers. One of the costs that you do need to think about is managing fraud. We do a very good job of managing fraud. We have both algorithmic and human resources dedicated to managing the fraud problem, and it's very straightforward to say that we are able to look at behaviors that are triggers of fraud and then arrest them pretty quickly. And we spend a fair amount of time and energy making sure that there are minimal vectors for fraud on the system. Another classic question is, what about money laundering? If you can put money into your virtual currency and then take it out, what's to prevent somebody from actually buying a bunch of virtual currency in one country, moving to another country, and extracting it, and maybe for various purposes? I think the answer is we've had in fact, almost no examples of this, and I would say that the reason for that is that there are probably easier ways to money launder than to do it through virtual currency. I think the truth is we haven't seen this. It's kind of a nice romantic story. It makes the sort of Wild West aspect of this very interesting, but the truth is it's simply not a phenomenon, mostly because if you're serious about money laundering, if you're trying to move $10,000 in a virtual world where the average transaction size is something like 40 cents, it's pretty easy to tell that you are money laundering. And if you want to actually sort of appear as a regular user of something like Second Life, you're going to have to spend a lot of time and energy, and it's probably not worth it. What do people buy most? We've already covered this primarily. It is clothing, at least in our model. It's clothing appearances, but as I said, it's very much a long tail of distribution, and very much grouped by genre. You can imagine that the genres of communities apply here, and people buy goods in sort of bundles that make them, good for medieval gameplay, or good for high fashion, or good for punk or goth or anime or whatever cultural genre they want to choose. Typical item pricing. Items, there's a median price and a mean price. The mean price is interesting because it represents some very, very big transactions. I think Entropia has at one point mentioned there was an item that was sold for over $100,000. It was like a Moonbase or something, pretty dramatic. But the truth is the sort of most popular price points are in the range of sort of $1 to $3 to $4, and so they tend to be relatively inexpensive relative to real-world goods. Is there a brand premium? Much was made, I think, in early Second Life days about the brands that were coming into Second Life, American Apparel, and then much was made in the press when they did not stay. I think the truth is that the brands never really were, I think, aligned with Second Life and the virtual currency, virtual goods model, simply because there aren't enough people in Second Life to make it interesting for them. What is interesting is that there are brands in Second Life that are resident-created brands, that are user-created brands that carry as much, if not more weight than some of the more kind of popular, known global brands. It is surprising to many people when they learn that some of the top brands in Second Life are pulling down income on the order of several $100,000 a year. And this may be with one or two or three people working together to build great products and to promote them in the platform. And it's clear that people will pay more for those brands, and they have more pricing power when they price their virtual goods. I do believe that in the future we will start to see real-world brands, and particularly as they look at larger platforms such as Facebook, you'll see real-world brands come into play, and I do believe that there is a brand premium. There will be pricing power that will be accorded to premium brands. And this last question, which is the one that is always interesting, is if there is this virtual kind of currency and its total money supply is roughly $25 million US, does Linden Lab have to kind of cash this out? And I think, again, as we described what a virtual currency is from legal terms, the answer is no. It's not redeemable. We do not have to redeem it. We don't have to keep the cash on hand to do that, even though, interestingly enough, the amount of cash Linden Lab does have on hand is roughly equal to slightly more than the actual money supply. And for those of you who are either interested in or starting to think about what it's like to be making an income in a virtual economy, there's some pretty significant businesses to be built here. I've already mentioned kind of the scale of some of the top merchants in Second Life on the orders of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some of them, a very small number, approaching even higher than that. I think what is interesting is in a recent survey that we launched to our residents, we learned that of the people who are making money, 20% said that it was their single source of income. And so I think that indicates to me that there are opportunities for people to actually make enough money to make a living out of it. I don't think that is true of the vast majority of merchants or content creators in Second Life. I think it is more of a hobby or diversion, or kind of the game is making things and creating them and selling them. It is, and yet it's still interesting that there's enough opportunity in this marketplace for people to succeed. All right. Well, I've talked a lot, and I think I'll invite you guys to come to Second Life if you're not already. The sticker is, of course, the one you put on the back of your car when you had made your visit. And I think at this point, I think I will open it up for questions.
Great. Well, you've already answered some of them. Those FAQ questions hit the one about money laundering. So we do have a couple people were asking, how does land supply play into the economy there? For instance, Will said that Linden Lab manages the exchange rate very well, but it's also a matter of managing land values. And he says there seems to be more of a zero-sum game there between Linden Lab and residents. Second Life makes more.
It's interesting. If you look at the composition of islands, there's some 30,000 islands, which represent kind of private spaces, if you will, in Second Life, and the mainland, which is sort of Linden maintained and Linden sourced and Linden managed, with people carving out parcels on the mainland and paying for those parcels. If you look at the mix of both activity and economic value is very much skewed towards the private island. And what that is, I think, is a reflection of the fact that that is independent of supply. That's more in the model of a private island is purchased, someone maintains it for as long as they like, as long as they want to keep it. They can resell it, but the resale activity around islands is relatively de minimis when compared with the resale activity on the mainland, which is to say that there's a marketplace of exchange around land on the mainland, and there's a much smaller one around the islands. And if you sort of think about those two in relation, it's almost an order of magnitude, but in difference in terms of volume of activity in marketplace trade on the mainland than on the islands. And so what's interesting about that is that the pricing dynamics on the mainland are very much a marketplace. The price is determined by the amount of demand, the amount of supply. We don't actually expand the supply on the mainland very often, kind of on the order of once a year or maybe twice a year. Some new parcels are made available, and that expands the supply slightly. It's really a function of the demand, and that demand on the mainland is related to how much people are willing to step up to the next sort of tier of ownership, which is a complete island. So we don't see the same kind of need to manage with supply the land side of the equation, because it's really demand that's driving that. Unlike the virtual currency, where we actually do have to be very careful to make sure that we are monitoring the amount of supply, so it doesn't change the value too dramatically. It's a very interesting space, and I think as we look at the overall kind of dynamics of land pricing, one of the things we watch as the marketplace evolves is, all right, well, which way is it heading, and why? And I think some of that goes primarily just to how many people are coming to Second Life in a given period of time, because that correlates very closely with the demand, which then, of course, drives the price.
Drives the price. Okay. And Kirk did ask for one further clarification. He wanted to know what percentage of the total economy is land sales?
That's a great question. I don't actually have the answer to that exactly. I can put it in context of if you look at the overall economy being sort of 50 million of U.S. dollar equivalent transactions every month, the amount of that which is related to purchasing islands from us or land from us, is probably on the order of, 400 or 500 islands a month, which would be $400,000 or $500,000 out of that 50 million. And then if you look at the mainland transaction, if you will, the marketplace of people trading their parcels on the mainland, again, it's de minimis. It's probably not more than a couple of percentage points. So I think much has been made about the kind of the virtual real estate model. I think the way we think about it is that land is a virtual good, but it tends to be one that's more persistent, less ephemeral, and more invested from the perspective of the user. They're making a commitment to pay for something over a period of time, as opposed to a one-time transaction for a virtual good that they can use as much as they want.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, Clay is asking some interesting questions about market research, and I'll just read them to you. First of all, does Linden Lab offer tools to allow vendors to reach an optimal price sooner? For example, price testing with exposure to part of the market before going to full market? And then he clarifies, is there a marketing testing or marketing research agency that they can use?
So the answer to the first question is no, we don't really provide tools. I know there are third parties that have built tools on top of the Second Life platform for market testing, basically getting consumers to take either a product concept and sort of do, if you will, a focus group and maybe the advantage of that is you don't have to rent this, a building and get 10 people from your city. You can actually do it around the planet. That does exist. I think if you were to search on those kinds of market research firms, with something like Market Research Second Life, you would probably find a couple of them. I would say that the demographics of the Second Life audience, interestingly enough, skew less. Well, let me say this way. I think many people have the perception that Second Life is predominantly male. It turns out that it is roughly balanced, male and female, and then if you look at participants in the economy, and particularly around virtual goods, it's actually skewed female. And so as you are constructing your market research, it's very wise to consider the demographics of the people that you can attract into the platform.
Well, that's really interesting. That is fascinating. There's market research firms in Second Life. Okay, well, here, Bradley has a question, and I think that you answered this, so maybe Bradley didn't hear. How many Linden dollars exist per unique user, and how constant is the value?
Well, the value, we just talked about how we work very, very hard to keep that value constant. I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things about a virtual currency and a virtual economy is that we're trying to retain stability in the economy to make sure that value and the investment, whether it's time or money that people have put into the platform, is protected. The flip side of that is the question about currency per person. I think based on our stats on our website, we track a bunch of different things, but if you were to sort of consider an active monthly repeat login, which is somebody who logs into the system more than once, which is to say somebody who's more committed than somebody who just logs in once, that number is about 750,000 people, and so if you were to do the quick math of dividing, roughly 24 million by 750,000, that would give you the U.S. dollar to active account kind of ratio. As far as I can tell, that's I think that's like $30. I'm sorry, I can't do the math in my head that well. 24 million divided by 750,000.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, it's about $30 a week. Is that right?
27.75.
Thank you.
I'm kidding. I don't know. I can't do that in my head either. Someone will tell us in a minute. So, so Will is asking why are the currency stats no longer as complete as they were a year ago, or less publicly available now?
Well, I guess I would say that they're actually not any different. If you are to search on Second Life Economy stats, you actually get the files that we continually publish. They're an automated publishing process on all the things like the sinks and sources, the size of the money supply. Any of the metrics I talked to today are still available publicly. I think what Will is referring to is that we actually had a web page that sort of had all these stats up. It is still up. It's not promoted as heavily, if you will, in the site hierarchy of our site, but you can get to it. There is one stat that, compared to last year, is not up there, and that is the overall island supply. And we found an error with that stat, and I actually don't know whether or not that error has been fixed, but that was maybe one of 30 different stats about the economy. So to answer your question, Will, it is there. We do publish the land stats as part of the quarterly kind of economy update, and I think if you want the information, it's there for you to grab.
Okay, good. Now here's a question I don't really understand, and maybe it's the way it's written. So it was from Annie earlier, and she was asking about U.S. dollars against euro and the yen. Does Second Life aim to be stable against the dollar or against a basket of currencies? We primarily accept Linden dollar, or Linden dollar purchases are primarily made by U.S. dollars. PayPal is our sort of primary vehicle, along with credit cards. Most of those are denominated in U.S., so we don't. We try not to take into account currency fluctuations or think about a basket of currencies. So I guess the answer to that is no, it's U.S. dollar only. Okay, good. Well, that's all the questions I have, unless other people want to chime in with some others here. I think I got all of them. But now's your chance, folks. Don't go away, Tom.
Oh.
So, okay, here's from Kitty. Will the Nebraska version of Second Life be connected to the Linden Lab virtual world economy? What's the Nebraska version?
Nebraska is the on-premise, behind-the-firewall version of Second Life that companies, organizations, educational institutions, governments use or will use, because it's not actually publicly available yet, will use for simulation and for training purposes or for collaboration, small group collaboration or events. Product is not available yet, so it's still being denominated by its code name of Nebraska. And I think in terms of the answer to the question, I think I'll defer that until at such time when the Nebraska team is going to launch the product.
Fair enough. And then Clay is asking another good question. Are there virtual goods in competitive games? Any examples of vendor names that he can look at? I think he wants to go into business or is in business.
Are there virtual goods in competitive games? The virtual goods are spreading like wildfire, and virtual currencies are spreading like wildfire throughout the gaming and social gaming and virtual world and social chat space. I mean, there's probably, I would say at the end of 2007, I think something like $400 million of venture capital went into funding for virtual worlds.
Wow.
So there are quite a few companies, and if I were to start naming them now, I think we probably wouldn't get off the phone for another 15 minutes. The ones that I think are interesting to look at, I would look at INVU. I think they recently announced some very successful results, and I think they are also probably closest to Second Life in that they allow third-party content creators to create content for the platform.
Okay. All right, so if someone's interested in going into business in a virtual economy, what would be a good resource for them?
Gosh, okay. Well, I'll mention one, and I gave a quote from the proprietor of this, Charles Hudson, earlier in the presentation. Engage is a conference around virtual goods. They just held this conference. It's a great place. There are many websites. I think if you were to literally just let your fingers do the walking and Google virtual goods, you'll come across 4 or 5. There are research firms that are starting to cover this space. I don't want to pimp anybody out too much, so you can discover them yourselves. But there are many firms.
Any good books? Not
I don't think I know of any good books. I would say that this is such an emerging space, and that the state of the art is evolving so rapidly that you're better off looking on the web.
Okay. And
maybe O'Reilly should do a book.
Well, we're thinking about it. So, Ram Prasad has one question. How is the virtual goods marketing changing with platforms like Facebook, the social network platforms? Does this affect Second Life? Is there any? Yeah,
I kind of touched on this in the beginning. When you think about those 3 values, whether it's the utility value, the identity value, or the communication value, and I would say it actually has probably popularized and the idea of sending someone a $1 birthday cake on Facebook, it seems relatively absurd. But I think what's interesting about it is that it's sort of I've never done it, but I'm guessing that Facebook's reach has made it more of a mainstream activity. That is very much in the kind of communications aspect of virtual goods, and as I said, we're kind of probably more weighted towards the utility and identity creation side of virtual goods. But that is not to say that we're not a social platform. One of the interesting stats about Second Life is we do 1 billion minutes, actually more than 1 billion minutes of voice each month, and that's it's sort of it's kind of unbelievable when you think about it, because 1 billion minutes of voice. Skype does about 8 billion, and Skype has probably 100 million active users, and we have probably 1 million. So certainly there's a whole lot of communication and a whole lot of expression going on in Second Life, and virtual goods are certainly a part of that.
Great. Okay, I think we're about out of time, and I just want to thank you so much, Tom. This was a great webcast. It was I think we all got a lot out of it, and you covered a lot of ground too. So we really
well, thank you very much, and thanks everybody for attending today. I'm honored and humbled actually by this incredible sort of phenomenon that I get to look at on a daily basis. It's a great job. But thanks for tuning in.
Wonderful. So thank you, everyone else, for joining us today. And I just want to say one more time, two quick questions. First of all, can people buy that Second Life sticker for their car? The real world?
I don't know. We probably should be able to, and maybe we'll take a look at that.
And then the other question is, I know we're going to have the recording available. Some people are asking if you'd make your slides available on SlideShare or your site or something. And I said I don't know, so you certainly don't have to, but they wanted to know.
Well, let me run it by our legal department, make sure they're all cool with that. Okay. I think most of the information I shared today is actually available today publicly, so I don't think there's anything untoward.
Okay, well, we'll have the full recording, and I'll send everyone a link to that very soon. So thanks, everyone. I'm going to close the meeting out now, and if you want to grab a copy of the chat transcript, you have to copy it from the chat room, and you can do that now on a Windows machine. You can do select all and copy, and then paste it in text file. On a Mac, it's a little more tedious. You have to actually copy the whole thing and then paste it in text file. If you don't get it in time before I close the meeting, just email me at webcast@o'reilly.com, and I'll send it to you right away. No problem there. So I'm closing the window out now. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.